Hello, I'm Dawn Jennifer, and I'm here to introduce the Lying In Department, which was operated by the Destitute Asylum in Adelaide, South Australia from 1878 to 1918. Lying in was the term used to describe the time before, during and after confinement, the final phase of pregnancy when childbirth took place. Set up by the South Australian colonial government in 1851, the Destitute Asylum offered a place of refuge for the poor, aged and sick, as well as pregnant women. The problem of how to house the destitute was an ongoing issue from the early years of the Destitute Asylum, and until the late 1870s, proper facilities for pregnant women had always been an issue and had never been solved with a permanent solution. The Lying In Department was built in response to concerns about the inadequacy of the women's quarters and a need to separate lying in women from other female inmates, as the occupants were called. The idea was that a purpose-built lying-in building would also provide a separate accommodation for different classes of pregnant women, so that respectable married women wouldn't have to experience childbirth in the same crowded ward as the, and I quote, diseased prostitute. So it was that the Lying-in Department, a two-storey building designed to accommodate about 30 women at a time, was built in 1878. Situated on Kintore Avenue on the northwestern perimeter of the Destitute Asylum site, bordering the city of Adelaide, the Lying-in Department provided accommodation and refuge for destitute, expectant, mostly single women. You can just see the roof and front of the first floor in the aerial view of the Destitute Asylum taken in 1936. Almost from the moment the building became operational, the Lying-in Department was often overpopulated. During the half-year ending 31st of December 1879, 56 women, of whom 11 were married, were admitted to the Lying-in Department. The chairman of the Destitute Board suggested that its reputation for being a comfortable lying-in facility had brought females from all over the colony, as well as from Queensland and Western Australia. Built on land traditionally owned by the Kaurna people, the building was designed by George Thomas Light, the government architect, and constructed by Brown and Thompson contractors. Reflecting the dominant architectural style of mid-Victorian Adelaide, combined with elements of Georgian design, the Lying-in Department was built of blue stone with red brick quoins, with a hipped roof constructed from galvanised iron sheeting. The front of the building faced into a yard and featured a first-floor balcony with a balustrade incorporating a simple crossbar pattern above a veranda, each running the full length of the building. You can see that the end of the first-floor balcony has been screened off. This was to prevent any woman on the balcony from communicating with anyone in the street. This photo, taken in 1918, shortly after the Lying-in Department closed, shows the front of the building during renovations for the next occupants, the government's Department of Chemistry. You'll notice that the ground floor windows are in the process of being enlarged. In the Lying-in Department days, they were the same size as the first floor windows. The rear of the building faced onto Kintore Avenue. During construction, the plans were altered to include the addition of a small kitchen with a bedroom overhead at the southern end of the building. At the same time, to save money, the windows on the first floor at the rear of the building were removed. Thus the building was constructed with only one window at the rear, which afforded light to the turn in the internal staircase. The first floor windows that you can see at the rear of the building today were added after the Lying-in Department closed in 1918. With a lack of windows at the rear of the building and small windows at the front, the impact on the lived experience of the women would have been to reduce ventilation and light in the wards. This would have had a stifling impact on the indoor environment and concurs with first-hand accounts of women locked away and hidden from view. In letters to her mother, Audrey Lady Tennyson, wife of South Australia's governor at the turn of the century and a frequent visitor to the Destitute Asylum, described the Lying-in Department in terms of separation and seclusion. She wrote that the women were locked into four walls in a separate building with a separate garden, where no one was ever allowed except the clergy, doctor or the women's mothers, so that nobody need ever know they have been there. Internally, as you'd expect, the building was modest, empty of adornment or extravagant decor. The inside has been described as well proportioned, and the uniformity of the slate fireplaces, panelled doors and plain timber mouldings, as thoughtfully composed as they are, create a restrained elegance, at the same time rigidly institutionalised. According to one Adelaide newspaper, the second floor consisted of two lying-in wards 30 feet long by 20 feet wide and 13 feet high. A third ward of similar dimensions was incorporated into the ground floor accommodation, which also included quarters for the matron made up of 3 rooms. By the time of this plan, about 1890, the ground floor lying-in ward was recorded as a dining room. Exactly how the use of the wards changed over time is unclear. What we do know is that women arriving for lying-in relief were classified according to the moral code of the day. Women were divided into 3 classes. First, unmarried women who had fallen only once, together with married women. Second, unmarried mothers who had previously had an illegitimate child or children. And third, prostitutes. Emily, my ancestor by marriage, first time pregnant, was admitted to the lying-in department in 1891 at the age of 16 years. One of nearly 2,000 women admitted at least once for lying-in relief between 1880 and 1918. Over 1/3 were between the ages of 15 and 19 years, a figure in common with other Australian colonies. Like most of the admissions, Emily was unmarried and usually employed as a domestic servant, the leading form of occupation for working class women at the time. The daughter of a confectioner, Emily's father had died shortly after her 2nd birthday. Her mother, Elizabeth, was described as being in poor circumstances. She had a young family of her own to support, without assistance, including a newborn baby of 3 weeks old, and was unable to provide for Emily's confinement. 3 days after admission, Emily gave birth to her son, Edward. Emily would have been attended by the lying-in department matron, who was also a qualified midwife. The Destitute Asylum was an early adopter of qualified midwifery, employing certified midwives from as early as 1880. At the time of Emily's confinement, Ellen Thompson was employed as matron. She was paid £75 per annum, with an additional 5 shillings per midwifery case. From 1881, in line with new legislation, any unmarried woman admitted for lying-in relief was required to sign an agreement with the Destitute Asylum, which stipulated compulsory residence for mothers until their babies had reached 6 months old. This condition was aimed at increasing maternal affection and attachment to reduce the incidence of early infant mortality and baby farming. Not all single women were happy with this arrangement. The records reveal that a handful of women absconded over the wall either prior to confinement or shortly after with their babies. Emily chose to stay. She remained in the lying-in department with Edward for just over 9 months. As part of the agreement that Emily signed, she would have been required to carry out domestic service duties delegated by the matron for the duration of her stay. She would have been fully occupied nursing and caring for Edward, as well as carrying out domestic work for the lying-in department and laundry for the Destitute Asylum inmates. Mothers could only leave the Destitute Asylum when their infants were less than 6 months old if they were taken either by relatives, were married women, or went to one of the refuges, and they had to sign an undertaking that the conditions regarding suckling could be fulfilled as they would have been had they remained in the Destitute Asylum. It was therefore easier for new mothers with babies under 6 months to leave if they were married and could return to their husbands. Destitute Asylum staff were required to search for putative fathers to prove their paternity and recover maintenance payments for their illegitimate offspring, which was used to offset some of the costs associated with maintaining the women during their admission. This was largely unsuccessful. For instance, in Emily's case, written and face-to-face attempts concluded with the observation that the putative father was a perfect larrikin, about 19 years of age, and that nothing would be gained by taking further action. Occasionally, the search for a putative father was productive. On 30th of April 1883, Bessie, admitted for lying-in relief in late 1882, and Joseph, the putative father of her child named in her records, were married in the Destitute Asylum chapel. Bessie was able to leave with her new husband when her infant was less than 3 months old. With the enactment of the Maternity Allowance Act 1912, which introduced a one-off payment of £5 for new mothers, equivalent to 2 weeks' wages and intended to cover medical costs, the numbers of women admitted for lying-in relief at the Destitute Asylum sharply declined. In addition, from 1917, the Queen's Home at Rose Park, South Australia's first maternity hospital, established by Audrey Lady Tennyson, had finally agreed to accept unmarried women, a development it had resisted since its opening in 1902. In 1917, the Destitute Asylum was moved from its city location to Magill, with a section set aside for lying-in relief. The lying-in department building closed the following year. Today, the old lying-in department building forms a part of the Migration Museum Adelaide. The first floor is occupied by museum staff, with the ground floor used for exhibitions. A permanent exhibition which tells the history of the Migration Museum site can be found in what were the matron's quarters. Thank you for listening.